Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're logging in from here today. I want to welcome you to our Raising Your Dairy Best Heifer webinar series. I'm Jen Bentley, and I work with ISU Extension and Outreach as a dairy field specialist here in Northeast Iowa. And this is our second season of Raising Your Dairy Best Heifer. We wanted to bring back this webinar series as there's a lot of new and upcoming topics happening in the dairy heifer world, and there's always some new practices, new management styles that people like to hear about. So we are going to continue this series for the next couple months here. And so we're going to kick off here today. Um, so just a couple things talking about the webinar itself. If you wouldn't mind just being muted during the presentation here, just to reduce some background noise and distractions during the webinar. If you do have questions, please put those in the chat box for comments, and then we'll either address those as we're going along here, or we'll address those at the end as we see fit for the conversation. So the session is recorded, and we'll share this out to the participants that registered for the webinar, as well as it will be put on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and review, you certainly can do that. I will also be putting into the chat later on an evaluation link if you wouldn't mind taking some time to fill that out. That helps us with our extension programming here, just to learn a little bit about what you've learned in this session as well. So like I said, to kick things off here today, we're going to be starting talking about pair housing. So what's all the fuss about pair housing calves and the benefits and management considerations? But I do just want to put a little reminder in there. These will be every Wednesday. So we'll have a full schedule here coming up through October and November. But I listed some of the upcoming ones coming up next week. We'll have Dr. Sarah Morrison with the Minor Institute talking about positive biofilms and calf health. But today we have with us Dr. Melissa Cantor. She's an assistant professor of precision dairy science in Penn State's Department of Animal Science. She leads research and extension efforts focused on improving calf health and welfare through precision technologies, early disease detection, and data-driven management strategies. So before joining Penn State, she earned her BS and PhD in animal science from University of Kentucky and her MS from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and completed her postdoc fellowship at the University of Guelph. So thanks for joining us here today, Dr. Cantor. I know you had a busy schedule last week with the Smart Calf Conference, but lots of good discussion was held there, and I think you have some things that you want to share here as well on pair housing. So with that, I'll let you share your screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy to be here, and hopefully, some people will trickle in. I'm talking about something that's actually near and dear to my heart, which is about socially housing calves. Most of this is going to refer to pair house calves. Occasionally, I'll talk about larger groups of calves. Um, but there's actually been some research that we've done recently that's really showing us that this has a lot of benefits for calves, and it's not even just growth performance always. There's many benefits. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic today. It's just as a reminder, I have to legally put in an affirmative action statement because this is an extension program. And as a reminder, when I mention calf health, I'm not providing veterinary advice for your particular farm. Specifically, I am just giving you information and summarizing the literature. So just keep that in mind. But we're going to talk about some of the reasons why pair housing or social housing for calves is increasing in popularity. And it's not just increasing in the United States, it's increasing across the world. And that really comes down to the social license. We're also going to talk about some of the mental benefits for calves. I know that sounds kind of funny, but believe it or not, the calves actually do learn differently when they're housed, even with just one extra calf, compared to our traditional individual housing. And then we're going to talk about what the growth benefits are and really summarize that for you so you don't have to read all the different papers that are out there. Lots of farmers are worried about health effects. And then we're going to do some myth busting and, of course, talk about the elephant in the room, which is always cross-sucking. So why should we think about pair housing if we know that individual housing works for the average farm? And the reason for this, in my opinion, first and foremost, is social license. When we think about the consumer who is purchasing our products, whether that's cheese, ice cream, or milk, They have to believe that what we're doing is socially acceptable. In other words, they need to be able to trust that dairy farming is a process that agrees with their morals and values. And if you don't believe that that's important and people will always eat ice cream and cheese, I caution you to think about an industry that went away overnight. Greyhound racing was essentially removed within a year because of legislation that essentially said that dog racing and betting couldn't be together. So this took out this industry in a year. We're seeing a very similar thing happening with horse racing. So the reason I'm bringing this up is we want to make sure that our practices for dairy farming do at least partially align with the values of our consumers. And of course, across the pond or the ocean, if you will, across the Atlantic, there are major retailers that are no longer allowing individual housing. There are propositions no longer allowing tethering of calves. For example, the Canadian Code of Practice is making it unacceptable to tether calves, and they're encouraging people to shift away from tie stall housing. So again, these things are starting to happen, and so we need to be thinking about that. And of course, I want to make sure I point out that when I talk about animal welfare, I understand that the maximum animal welfare scenario is not always economically viable for the farm. And it is important that we remain profitable to stay in business, right? Usually, we all can accept that cows out on pasture with no protection from predators, etc., that those animals obviously have less welfare than the way we manage our cows, putting them in a barn, giving them parasite control and feed, etc. We also can accept that there are scenarios where the animal has the worst welfare scenario. And realistically, culture is going to decide what animal welfare standards should be, and this shifts with time. So understand, and when I hear sometimes people saying individual housing was encouraged in the 80s. We used to pair house, we used to group house. Now we didn't do that anymore. Remember, guys, like cultural does change. Those shifts change, those consumer trends change. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that we need to, as an industry, keep these things in mind when we're making our management decisions. As an example, there was a really cool survey done about 5 years ago with over 1,000 consumers at the state fair in Minnesota, and they showed people three pictures. None of these people were allowed to have any experience showing cows or farming or 4-H. They had to be completely naive consumers. And what I found really interesting is most of them did not approve of individual housing and weren't even aware of the practice at all. This is a concern, right? Because it's basically saying that the consumer would like to see young calves together and not necessarily always have to be with their mom, but that they at least want to see calves with other calves. And that's important because it's a compromise. I had said earlier that there are processors out there, such as Tesco. This processor purchases over 33% of the milk supply produced in the total United Kingdom, and they are mandating social housing, again, because of literature. So it's really, really important for us to understand that sometimes trends force change. And here's an example of a photo of a farm that did not have time to acclimate their facilities to meet the demands of these changes. So this is an example of perhaps not an ideal pair housing scenario for calves, but this guy had to get creative very quickly to meet these demands. So again, this is just pointing out that I recognize these aren't always fair to the farmer, but that they are the reality that we're living with. And if you're not completely convinced, yes, with this mandate, less farms are now using individual housing in the UK. As you can see here, we have shifted down to 38%, when in 2010, 60% or the majority were individually housing. These are very similar statistics to us, which is why I'm highlighting it. So, what are some of these benefits that we actually see in calves? I like to always start out with a picture like this. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure every farmer out there, if they turn their dry cows out at pasture, they've experienced a scenario where they don't know where the calf is. They know the cow calved. They're like, where the heck is the calf? We have to go find her. Their cows have a natural instinct to hide their calf. And the reason, and then within about 5 to 7 days, that cow will reintroduce those calves to the herd. And the cows will actually spend most of their time hanging out with each other. So, believe it or not, only a small portion of the day surrounding milk feeding that the calf is interacting with its mom. In general, Calves prefer to spend most of their time with each other in little groups called creches. So when we think about offering a calf to another calf, we assume that there's a lot of benefits that can be added to that calf's social development because that's actually how they naturally would hang out. Now, I know that the way we raise calves on a dairy farm is not necessarily natural, and which of course is a subjective term anyway. But I just like to remind everyone that really Mother Nature and a calf really only designed her to be hidden away for a couple days. And we think that's because of this dependence on colostrum from the mom. Once that calf has that passive transfer of immunity, she obviously gets reintroduced to the herd. They're also just not as adaptive. So there are lots and lots and lots of studies out there about this. Calves housed individually compared to pairs or more complex groups. They're more aggressive. They're more fearful. They have poor social ranking. They don't compete as well. So when we think about the way we design our farms, we're constantly moving cows into new groups. These things are really important for success, right? In that environment. And just pair housing can improve that success. These socially housed calves also listen differently. And again, this is a video courtesy of Dr. Costa from Vermont. But you can see that socially housed calves, sometimes one of the calves may not want to be with its friend all the time, right? I would argue that the white calf is awful annoying compared to the other calf in reality, right? But at the end of the day, something about this social interaction between these two calves actually promotes social skills, competitiveness, and adjustment to new environments better than calves that would be housed separately. And so you can see here, this calf is pretty annoying for this calf in this video. But it's just to highlight that the social calves that these calves are developing really can, even in a confined environment like this, they can happen. So, when we think about individual housed calves versus socially complex housing, that's what this study did. So they were comparing cows that were with their calves that could not drink. So the cows were wearing udder nuts, believe it or not. But they just wanted to see if you offer calves access to other calves and their mom, and we compare that to individually housed calves, how do they perform cognitively? And the first thing I want to tell you is that they trained these calves to approach computers, which I think is pretty unique and it's a little bit different. But they basically taught the calves that white is good and red is bad. If you do the other one, you get punished. And so here's an example. The calf has learned that it pushes this button. If it sees a red screen, then it gets milk if it touches the screen. And it's a very small amount of milk, right? They're not giving them a ton of milk here. So the calf touches, if the calf had gone and touched the screen when it was white, the calf would have been punished and got nothing for a while. So you can see this calf is really annoyed because it wants a red screen because it knows if it touches that, it's going to go get milk. So you can see here that these calves do learn this task and it takes them a while to actually figure that world out. In social housing, calves figure out these different color associations within basically 5 to 8 sessions. So you can see everyone learns it by 10 sessions. So it does take a lot of time to train these calves to do this, but in social housing, they do all figure it out. And the individually housed calves do too. They take about on average one more session, but they do figure it out. They figure out one color means milk, one color is bad, don't do that or you won't get anything. But what's really cool about this study is they did the opposite. So they said, okay, we're going to change it up. We're going to reversal learn on these calves. And now they're going to have to figure out that the bad punishment color is good now. And the negative one is going to be the one that used to give milk. And what I think is really cool about this is that it takes these calves, as you can see, there's 3 sessions where they're like, what the heck is going on? And then they figure out by about the same amount of sessions as before, 10 to 11, they figure out that the opposite color means, oh, okay, I get milk in this scenario. However, if you're an individually housed calf, you never figure this out. So keep this in mind. Like when we change the system up on an individually housed calf, they have a really hard time learning that other scenario. So they learn something a certain way and they need to do it that way, or they have a really hard time. You can see most of these calves, only 30% ever figured it out. Most of them just live a life of frustration in terms of reversal learning, which I think is really fascinating. And we know calves don't play with computers, right? I actually like to always joke that if we think about that cow that has to be on one side of the parlor when she comes on a certain side, would that cow be like that if she was housed in social housing? Again, because they have this really hard time unlearning something once they learn it a certain way, if they grew up in a hutch or an individual pen. So, simply put, these calves do learn better. As I said just now, they reverse learn tasks much easier and they're more optimistic as well. So, some farmers have fought back on that and said, well, they're not optimistic. They just are more competitive. And that's probably true too. What they did in that particular study is they offered calves milk on one side of the barn and said, this is your good, this is when you get milk. The other side, they get nothing. Same exact thing as a computer study. And then they put one bottle in the middle, and the calves had to understand whether or not that middle side was either going to have milk or not. So the pair house calves always just assumed milk was there, whereas the individually housed calves very rarely ever tried. So the idea here is they're more like positive thinkers. The glass is half full, the bottle's half full, there's milk in there. But again, farmers have pushed back and said, well, they're just more competitive, and that might be true too. So again, pair housing does have a lot of benefits for calves. We also know that when you house calves individually, they have a harder time with new food. So in this particular study, they offered calves carrots, and they were curious at how long it was going to take these calves to actually eat carrots. How long was it going to take these calves to eat hay? And what's really interesting to me is that the individually housed calves consume less of the new food, as you can see here, much less compared to the socially housed calves. And we can see that the time it takes for those calves to actually eat that new food is much, much, much higher if you're individually housed. So it takes over almost 3 hours for those calves in individual housing to touch these carrots or to touch these hay. And less so, obviously, to approach the bucket itself, but to actually eat the food, it takes forever. And you can see those calves that were actually raised with access to their mom and other calves, those little guys, they took a lot less time. So there's something about social housing that even helps with new scenarios and knowing what's safe and what isn't. So I get asked all the time, well, that sounds great that there's all these cognitive benefits, but my veterinarian has always told me that pair housing could be dangerous for calf health. The actual fact is that triplet and pair housing have not been observed to have any effect on calf health. Zero studies have found that. And so that's good, because we don't want that, right? And so in this, I'm about to present you a slide showing that. But just as a reminder, in this particular studies, we're talking about diarrhea that's loose or watery feces, not calves fed more milk that have a yogurt. This is important for interpreting the results of what I'm about to show you. And when we're talking about respiratory disease, we're talking about either the UC Davis system or the Wisconsin system, where we're looking at outward signs of disease, right? So again, eye discharge, nasal discharge, and ear tilt. That's what we're looking for there. So here, and that ear tilt. The good news and the thing that I can share with you today is that most studies observe absolutely no negative effects in pair housing or triplet housing. So you can see here that the only studies that found anything, this study found that individually housed calves had an increased risk of disease. They were 88% more likely to have diarrhea and or respiratory disease. And this particular study found in week 3, there was an interaction. They found that, oh, the pair house calves had more diarrhea in week 3 than the individually housed calves. However, they only had 10 pairs and they had no control calves, meaning that they didn't have any healthy calves in their study. So we can't really we can't compare one calf to itself. In science, that's not correct. So I always dismiss this study because we can't really interpret the findings. So with that being said, look at all these other studies that have found no effects, right? 22, 2012, 22, 164, 21. So we have a lot of animals enrolled in these different published studies, and none of them are finding anything bad. So that's a good thing. So I always try to tell people and assure them that really the risks have not been observed in the literature. Now, if you're interested in social housing, I got to remind you all of something everyone in the room already knows about. We know that passive transfer of immunity, you can't change individual housing to something more complicated and not have the basics correct, right? So just remember that you still got to do a great job with making sure that your calves are passing. And I don't mean testing your colostrum. That's not enough. You need to test your calf serum here, like in the picture, and make sure that you're actually getting calves in the good and excellent categories. And I'll show you a slide on that in a second. We want to make sure that we're not just getting calves to pass anymore. 90% of farms are already getting 90% of calves are already passing according to the USDA data. So now we need to push to get those numbers higher. And again, if you're interested in doing social housing, make sure you're testing these calves at 24 hours to 3 days of age. Why? You test them when they're older, you might accidentally say the calf failed when the calf didn't fail. Or you may accidentally categorize the calf wrong. So it's really important you're doing this when they're really, really young to make sure that the serum total protein readings are accurate. And again, this is really important that you're striving for 40% or more of your calves have a serum total protein of over 6.2. I'm going to let this slide sit for a second because I really want you all to understand that getting calves to just get passing is not enough to make social housing work well. You have got to get many of your calves, the majority of them in these other categories. The reason for this, and I'll show you on the next slide, is because you need these calves to have herd immunity to lower your risk of respiratory. I'm sure everyone has heard of a farm that pulled out a robotic milk feeder because they had pneumonia problems. And I promise you, there were two reasons that happened. One, their facilities weren't built correctly. And two, they didn't have their transfer of passive immunity in the right place. You have to have calves not just passing. It isn't enough to do a good job with these more complex systems. Got to push calves in these higher categories. And so if you're not convinced, and you can just ignore this. This is my example here for my calves. So it's not even just passing, but the amount of IgG the calf receives. So this is a large study from the USDA in Journal of Dairy Science. And look, the excellent calves at 6.2 grams per liter serum total protein, also known as 25 grams of IgG per liter. Those calves at 25 or higher are in a completely different scenario for disease probability. By weaning, you only have 25% of your calves having diarrhea and or respiratory. That's very low compared to these guys. Look, we know the failures are bad, right? Every farm is avoiding this. But look, even if the calf passes and just barely passes, so again, this is a calf with a 5.1 serum total protein level. Look at that. 35% to 40% of your calves are going to get a disease just because of colostrum. This is huge. So if you're thinking about switching to social housing, you got to check your serum total proteins on your calves. Now, here's an example of us. So in last year, our calves, we were doing a great job with colostrum last year, and 40% of our heifers were falling in excellent, which is exactly what the USDA recommends. So we had pair housing. We were doing a great job. However, the farm started losing people. We had some layoffs and some staffing issues, and we had to hire a bunch of new people. And I switched us to individual housing until we could overcome this. And now we're finally in a place where I'm confident to go back to group housing. Because again, you can see that we're just at a place right now where we have too much challenge to make that a success. So again, it is, and I know that that's not realistic for a commercial farm to switch around, but I'm just saying, like, it's really, really important. It matters that much. The other thing is, and I know everyone's already heard this before, is cleanliness. I really believe, I'm a firm believer in pictures. Calves really thrive when we do everything really well. But what people don't seem to ever remember is that even if we do everything okay, and we just missed the mark a little bit, that's enough to cause problems. So I have an ATP meter here. Look at this. this dishwasher is doing such a great job cleaning calf nipples on this commercial farm that they don't have any bacteria or fungus or any living. So this is measuring this basically it's measuring this particular thing called luciferase essentially that's emitted by all living things. And as you can see here, it basically creates a light that it can measure. It's called an ATP meter. And as you can see here, there's essentially nothing dirty here, which is amazing. And this was a commercial farm that was struggling with a salmonella challenge. And so you can see this farm was sanitary as all get out, had excellent management of their tubes, their calving change. Everything was just so clean. And I took pictures because I thought, sometimes it's not always obvious what's going wrong, right? They have beautiful facilities that were really well managed and clean. So again, cleanliness is huge. It's a really important thing for making social housing like this successful. And again, it's just as important as colostrum. There's also biological performance benefits of pair housing. So what I mean by that is growth benefits or calf starter benefits. The first one that's a lot less known, and this is very new literature, is that actually calves, I don't know if you can see this photo, but these calves actually are hanging out together. So this is a photo courtesy of Dr. Van Oss's lab, and they did a study for cold stress because it's very cold in Wisconsin most of the time. And they actually found that calves that hang out together keep the hutch warmer, which is amazing. That's so cool that just social housing can help these calves through the winter better because they use each other for warmth. We can also promote feeding more milk to calves to encourage more milk in the first lactation, right? This is a very famous study. Everybody's seen this before. This is a meta-analysis. I made a bad choice making this white font. Apologies for that. But essentially what this slide is saying is that for every bit of average daily gain that we get of those calves before they're weaned, we're actually getting increased milk production. And there's a moderate positive relationship there, right? So again, the farms that are getting those calves to hit at least 700 grams a day average daily gain, the ones that are getting farms to do more than doubling their birth weight, right? Because this is doubling. Those farms are benefiting from more milk in that first lactation. That's huge. So remember that, when we pair house calves, we need to be thinking about potentially offering more milk as well. Dr. Costa from Vermont had done a really nice literature review looking at this, showing that no individually housed calf studies ever do better than pairs, ever. It doesn't matter if these studies are done in Europe, South America, Canada, the United States, Australia. They've done them all over the world, and they've never found that individually housed calves have better growth. It just isn't a thing. And you can see here, he found only positive benefits: dry matter intake improvement, dry average daily gain improvement, and weaning weight improvement. But I get asked by farmers all the time, why do some studies find no difference and some find a positive difference? So because of that, one of my master students, Jillian, did her scoping review literature review here. And she really started to dig into this, like, what is the reason? And so this is stuff from the past 10 years, essentially. Much more literature has come out to show these growth benefits. And she really broke it down and said, well, geez, why are some of these studies finding benefits and some find nothing? What is the reason for that? It depends. And then the biggest thing here is whether or not you're offering enough milk to your calves. So farm research that's been done in this topic finds that calves improve their grain intake more often than not. That seems to be the biggest benefit, but it's only observed if you're offering at minimum 7 liters a day. So I tell farmers, if you're going to offer a conventional 5 to 6 liters of milk, if we're talking about quarts, 6 quarts per day, then don't do pair housing because you're not going to get any growth benefits. And now you just have to change you'll still get social housing benefits. So again, some of those learning abilities, which still has some pros. But honestly, for the cross-sucking risk you're going to introduce into your farm, it's not worth it. I personally think, this is my own personal opinion, the literature shows 7 liters a day at minimum. Offer your calves 7.5 liters. So that would be the bigger bottle going all the way to the top, right? The rim. That will at least get the grain benefits of earlier grain, more grain intake, and in some cases, it improves growth, but not for every farm. That has to do with disease. As a reminder to farms, we cannot abruptly wean socially housed calves. It does not work. It's an absolute disaster, especially because we are also usually feeding more milk to get those benefits that I just told you about. So, as a reminder to everyone, and I know that this is all refresher for everyone, the digestive of system of a newborn calf, as shown in this photo here, look at how tiny the rumen is. It's just that blue box there at the top of my screen. It's a 25% of the digestive system. I hear all the time, oh, I limit feed calves to get them on grain. But remember, this newborn calf's entire stomach is an abomasum, as you see here. The rumen is not functional at all. That first 1 to 15 days of age, it barely does anything. So it's really, really important that farms are feeding milk for that reason alone. That's the only real source of calories that a calf can metabolize at this really young age. And we're asking these calves, weaning them so early in life, we're asking them to develop their entire foregut pretty quickly, right? So we're asking that abomasum to become 7% of the digestive capacity after weaning. We're asking the rumen to massively expand, right? It's going from 25% of the capacity as shown in the photo to 80% after weaning. So if we are not appropriately step down weaning these calves over at minimum 7 days, we're going to have problems. And keep in mind, you're putting all those calories into that calf and paying for that growth. You want to maintain that growth after weaning and not have slumps. And the way to do that is, in fact, to do this type of slow step down weaning strategy. I know that this is a refresher for everyone, but I think it's pretty important. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. Look at the massive capacity difference in the digestive system of these animals. I'm a nutritionist. If you thought you could get away without nutrition, calf nutrition in this talk, you would have been wrong. You can see here, look at that. They go from such a tiny capacity. This is the rumen of a 90-day-old calf. So as you can see, it looks almost identical to what it would look like in a mature cow. But the only reason it looks this well developed and is because of an appropriate step down weaning strategy, a good high crude protein grain. I personally prefer 20% crude protein. You can go as low as 18. You want the calves to be using this because you need to get that butyrate in the rumen and develop those papillae. And here's a photo showing that. Again, as a reminder, we need to get the calves off of the milk and onto the grain, otherwise we have this problem. Look at how much, or how little I should say, rumen papillae we have. This is a newborn calf's rumen. And again, you can see these are famous photos from Dr. Heinrichs here at Penn State that we need that grain to get consumed. And with that, we also need water, right? So calves need to consume at least 1% of their body weight before they're weaned. So 2 pounds for a 200-pound calf. Personally, I think this is a very low estimate. I honestly think we should be getting calves to consume much more than that. My recommendation is 4 pounds per calf before weaning, because then you're priming that rumen up to just digest that appropriately. All right. So I mentioned that social housing could be all encompassing, so it's not just pair housing. There are much more complex systems out there, right? We know that there's automated milk feeders out there. Again, if you're interested in doing this type of system, though, you have to be doing a really good job with calf management beforehand. So again, sanitation, colostrum, and health are really important here. But if you're doing those things right, you really do have the opportunity to even promote growth in these calves even more so than a traditional system. And the reason for that is because you're allowing the calf to make a choice. So this is a particular study that was interested in phase feeding. So they wanted to know, if we allow calves free choice of milk early in life, the minute they're on that robot, do they do better than the calves that slowly got ramped up on the robot? And what we found, and what I really want to highlight here, is that the average milk intake of these calves is nowhere near the top line of where they could be. However, it's important to highlight here that we're allowing the variation. So you see the means here and the deviations are quite wide. So this is variation. You can see here that when we give calves a choice, some of them are going to consume more than others. And the robot is really nice because we're not throwing that money down the drain. If we were doing this in pair housing or another kind of pen setup, we would be wasting milk if those calves don't drink it all. And that's really hard for any farmer to rationalize, including me. I also don't want to pay for bags of milk replacer that we dump down the drain. So here's a cleaner version of what I just said. Statistically, we see, so this is again the actual model output. Before it was the raw data. You can see here that these calves that are offered peak milk later consume more milks from week 4 all the way till they start to step down wean at week 7. What I think is really cool though is they weighed the same. So by 56, 60 days of age, we followed these calves actually for 9 weeks. And you can see here, this is just the milk intake graph. So you can see by 9 weeks of age, we saw that they weighed the same, 90 kilos of same. So almost 200-pound calves, right? Crazy. These little guys were basically eating so much grain that they were able to compensate for these guys on the heavy milk plan. So my lesson is if you have a robot, you can offer almost free choice milk the first 3 to 4 weeks of life and start weaning those calves really early and get them on the grain. And they're very successful animals. And then you're also not feeding nearly as much extra milk. These guys here consumed 2 extra bags of milk replacer. So again, the slow plan was way more expensive and they weighed the same. We're also doing some other stuff. This is a little outdated slide. Basically, we're currently testing some different algorithms on the robot. Again, this is just the potential of it in the future. Do these algorithms predict disease? Yes or no? The answer is we're working on it. And in the lab, these work really well. So now we're testing it on real farms, including research farms, to see if this is true. And we're testing lots of different stuff in that regard. Of course, in a group this complex, you start to deal with respiratory problems. Initial investment can be really costly. I suggest that you should limit your group size to no more than 15 calves. That's really where we see the benefit kind of tapering off in terms of respiratory issues. Obviously, cleaning this barn is very different than cleaning individual housing. All in, all out is better. Again, I told you stocking density is a challenge. And again, of course, the bigger the group, the bigger the risk, right? That's just a fact. If you have a larger, more complicated group, even if you're mob feeding with groups of 10 to 15 calves, if you have a Salmonella Dublin outbreak or a Clostridium outbreak or whatever, the challenge is more complicated and much more hard to deal with because there are simply more animals spreading that pathogen in a smaller space. So I always tell everyone it's very important to offer 50 square feet of footage per calf. Clearly, this farm is not doing that, right? These calves are packed in like sardines here. But this is really important to keep in mind that we need to be thinking about providing space for when we have a lot of calvings. Ventilation is super important. It's beyond the scope of this talk today, but if you have a really crummy facility that you're thinking about putting a robot in, please don't. Don't do it. You will tear it back out. It is not worth it. Ventilation is really important for lung health in calves. Pair housing has advantages in the fact that it's just so much easier to adapt with the farming systems we have. Some farms go all out. They're going to buy new super hutches and use those. Our farm is lazier. We use calf tail pens that we put together. So we simply pull a panel and then the calves are together. This is actually 2 pens, but as you can see, they like to waste a lot of time together. Pair house calves spend 60% of their time together, according to one study. So again, they really like to hang out with each other. Now, social housing is not perfect. There's a lot of issues. A particularly age gap between a pair can get to be a problem. So on this particular farm, this is, of course, this is from Canada. The beef, bull calf, Jersey calves are still not worth a lot of money in Canada. So this farm's solution was to take free bull calves from the farm down the road. They were pretty small. They only have 100 cows, so they were struggling to get their calves' age gaps to be small enough. So that's what their solution was. Some other farms might put in a barrier between the teats here to limit calves' ability to steal when they're being fed milk. Some others may use headlocks. There's absolutely no research on how much space to offer pair house calves. 30 square feet is a number that kind of came out of nowhere. Honestly, I don't think there's a good number for this, and more research needs to be done. We also need to remember that cross-sucking is a bigger problem if we limit feed milk. So the more you restrict that milk, the more you'll see that in the early life. However, the more milk you feed, the greater the chance of cross-sucking if you don't wean them right. So there's that relationship, that balance there. We need to make sure we're offering these calves a teat. We need to make sure we're weaning them correctly. And oftentimes people forget that post-weaning nutrition is equally important to limit cross-sucking. So when I go to a farm and I see a bunch of nose flaps in their calves, I know their post-weaning diet has something wrong, or their weaning strategy has something wrong. Because usually calves cross-suckle because they're hungry. That's kind of where the behavior comes from. Now, we also know that the more restrictive the environment is, the more abnormal their behavior can be. So that could be pen sucking, that could be cross sucking, that can be pushing on other calves. And if you do open bucket feeding, you're even encouraging that further. So just remember that. Some solutions to deal with some of these problems is giving things for calves to do. Now, I'm realistic. I know that most farms cannot afford calf brushes for their calves, but for robotic pens with lots of calves in them, this is an option. Calves will play with brushes, ropes, chains, balls, and if you take these things away, they will actually look for them. They will go seek them out. Where is my ball? Where is my blah blah blah? Some of these are more exciting than others. In my experience, the ball's only cool for about 20 minutes and then the calves lose interest, whereas the brush stays interesting throughout life, right? We know cows like to scratch. Forage has been very, very much successful in larger groups of calves at giving them something to do. This basically redirects oral behavior into the forage instead of the pen. We know hay is really important for the thickness of the rumen. So again, while it's not promoting papillae development, it can have some other benefits. And believe it or not, when you give calves ropes, balls, chains, and scented hay, they pick the hay over everything. So something about that is really preferable by calves. And again, we should always offer low quality hay to make sure that we're not limiting starter intake. So I'd hate for you to give your first cut alfalfa to post-wean heifers. I don't think that's the right place for it simply because maybe the calves will choose that over starter, although there are plenty of farms that are successful with that. They do just a fine job. So keep that in mind. I'm just saying that in certain cases. Hay calves actually grow better over 70 days than the controls. Um, and enrichment also can decrease abnormal behavior. So this is a bottle that actually has grain inside of it, and the calves can eat grain. One study found that this reduces how long they cross-suck for, and it also discourages the behavior in general. But we need to make sure we're still offering a bucket of grain because this is not enough, right? To encourage grain intake. So in summary, paired calves in early life, they do eat more grain. And they get most of those benefits if they're being fed more than 7 liters a day. They maintain their growth advantages as well. There's some research coming out from UW-Madison and the University of Florida that show that these animals maintain growth advantages all the way out to calving. There's no literature suggesting disease risk increases with parent versus individual. If you're trying to do this, limit the age difference within a pair to 2 weeks, no more than that. Personally, I think people should pair their calves sooner. I'm realistic that smaller 100 cow herds are not going to be able to necessarily do that. Some farms are creative, they'll find solutions. We don't have free bull calves laying around right now in the States, but some will come up with solutions that work for their farm, like finding free bulls, Jersey bull calves, as an example. Providing teats and outlets is really important. So again, we need them to have something to do. They're still going to cross suckle even if we do all of that. I just did a study on this. They spend about a minute per day cross sucking around the milk feeding. So we watched them for 6 hours a day, and we found that within that 6 hour period surrounding milk feeding, we still saw cross sucking, but it was about a minute a day. So it still occurs, but I don't know how much cross sucking it takes to damage the udder. We don't even know if that's actually a real relationship. Some say it is, some say it isn't. Personally, I think blind quarters do happen cross sucking, and we need to approach cross sucking in that way. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cantor, for all the great information. Um, if anybody has any questions, they can certainly type them in the chat box here as we conclude. I am going to put in the evaluation link. I just about forgot to do that before we exited here, but as we're kind of waiting for some questions, I did have some questions, Dr. Cantor, just about when we're talking about higher amounts of feeding milk.
Mhm.
Do you see herds having to feed that in more multiple feedings if they're in pair housing? I know automatic calf feeders, you can do that, but if you're pair housing, are you going to have to consider going out there 3 times a day versus twice a day?
Great question. So that's why I always say 7.5 to start because we can squeeze that into 2 meals and they do just fine. As long as you're really measuring total solids and making sure your temperature at feeding is correct, you can push them into those 2 meals. Once you go over that 8 liter limit, you really need to start thinking about adding in another meal if you're gonna push them up to 10 or something like that. But yeah, if you can go all the way up to 7.5 liters with 2 feedings, and as long as you're very, very careful about your total solids and your temperature at feeding, you can get away with it. It's just the margin for error is slim there, so you are pushing them on the absolute limit if you keep it at 2 feedings.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And my other question, if I don't see other questions yet in the chat box, but was about the Braden bottles.
Mhm.
And just wondering about cleanliness of those. How often do you find that they get built up, humidity kind of making the feed,
What an excellent
less
question.
poor quality?
So for our farm, we don't do it as often as we should. We really only clean them in between groups. So once we have calves complete the study, we take those, we throw them into a big trash can full of water and bleach that only is used to clean teats, and let them sit for a couple days. That's probably not the right approach. I think probably they should get changed out more often than that. We're surprised that the feed rarely ever gets like moldy or whatever. The calves do eat a lot of that starter that is provided in that Braden bottle. So it's just, I don't think it's enough to encourage the intake we need for weaning to get them rumen developed properly.
Sure.
So to answer your question, there isn't a lot of science behind that.
Mhm.
That's just what has worked for us. And the other thing is replacing the teats frequently enough, which is also something we don't do enough, because then we're wasting grain when they fall on the ground.
Okay, I see Larry had put a question in here. Calves housed individual but have wire between dies that count for, maybe Larry, can you unmute? Oh, calves housed individual but have wire between, does that count for something? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So to answer that question, there's been some studies done to show how much work a calf will put in to physically touch that other calf, like with full body contact. And the calf will push over 3 times its body weight to access that. So it is one of the most highly desirable things a calf could have access to. I personally don't think that those calves with wire mesh in between pens are getting the same social benefits when it comes to feet competition, when it comes to social contact, as calves that are housed individually with the wire mesh. And the other thing to keep in mind is if a farm is already housing that way, they're not protecting from transmission of disease. So why are they even being separated? That's always my argument. If you already have those wire pens between, you're actually not protecting those calves from transfer of horizontal transfer of disease. So why not put them together? Why not have that pair, right? So that's always my argument when people say that. I know that type of housing is kind of common because it's very cheap and easy to do. But in my experience, I don't think the calves are getting the same exact benefits as those with full contact. And I only have the research where we've tested how much they work to access to site for that. So someone probably should do another study to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that the benefits are not all achieved there.
Great. Thanks for answering that. That's a good question. Do we have any other questions from the group? I must have a list of 20 questions here for us. So I have one more question for you. So
Yeah.
hay is always a great debate, right? So
Yes,
I know
it's a
you
huge
talked about
debate.
um, offering hay to larger groups of calves.
Mhm.
So if you're pair housing, would you still say offering a bit to just
Yeah,
for some of that satiation?
it's actually a great question. We just tested this over the past 2 years at our farm, and we found that it improved body weight. So the calves actually grew better. It didn't change calf stat or dry matter intake, but it didn't discourage cross-sucking, which was the whole reason we were offering it. So I'm personally, I think there are other benefits for rumen health that hay offers to calves. I also think that we need to do a heck of a lot more research with pair house calves to understand and really pull out what the reasons are for offering the benefits are for offering that hay to those calves. So my answer is I don't think it hurts them. It doesn't negatively compromise starter dry matter intake, which is great. It doesn't negatively compromise their solid feed efficiency, which is great. But at the same time, is it helping with cross-sucking? Not what we observed. And I don't have an answer as to why. We did offer a pellet, so maybe the form wasn't exciting enough. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a fair
Great. Well,
question.
looks like there's a lot of research to come on pair housing and just
Yeah.
social housing in general. I think there's been a lot of, just in the last few years, there's a lot more projects
Hmm.
emphasizing the group housing. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So we'll give people, 5 or 10 minutes back in their day if they want to log off. But I sure appreciate your information here today, Dr. Cantor. It's been great information. Like I said, this is going to be recorded, or this is recorded. So we'll get this out on our YouTube channel for people to review. So if you haven't, please click on the evaluation link before you log off here today. So with that, we'll conclude. Thank you.
Bye.